Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something absolutely wild and, frankly, deeply tragic. We're going to be unpacking a concept called the broken operating system. We are looking at a really complex paradox in modern mental health care. What actually happens when the medical system's proposed cure for severe trauma doesn't just fail, but actively causes profound, measurable harm to the patient? Today, we're examining the systemic denial of dissociative identity disorder and why treating it as something it's not is so incredibly dangerous. And that brings us to a terrifying question that anchors our entire deep dive today. Imagine going to a doctor for help, but the treatment they give you is fundamentally incompatible with the very structure of your mind. How is a person supposed to survive when their own doctors treat a literal neurological barrier as nothing more than bad behavior, or even worse, intentional manipulation? Section 1. A fractured reality, the architecture of the hidden mind. Okay, let's get into this. To really understand what's happening, we have to move way past those harmful Hollywood stereotypes of dramatic costume changes and look at how the brain actually organizes itself to survive unthinkable childhood trauma. Our source documents use this brilliant analogy of mismatched operating systems. Think of a neurotypical brain as running on a single-mind operating system. It assumes a continuous timeline and a singular unified consciousness, right? But a mind with DID is running a multi-mind operating system. To survive unspeakable trauma, the brain's physical hardware literally had to partition itself into isolated bubbles of time. It's a remarkable, almost awe-inspiring survival mechanism, but it leaves the patient with a fundamentally different neurological architecture. So, what does that actually look like? Well, this partitioned hardware results in what's known as structural amnesia. And you guys, this is not just forgetting where you left your keys. It's a fundamental inability to perceive the continuous linear mechanics of the physical world. Without a continuous thread of time to observe, the logical progression from cause to effect just goes completely missing. To the patient, the world feels entirely random, like a reality lacking a cohesive fabric. I love this analogy from the sources to explain the day-to-day reality. Imagine a busy restaurant, but there is absolutely no manager. An employee at the front takes a customer's order, but because of a thick amnesic wall, they have zero communication pathway to the kitchen. The kitchen staff, representing the other parts of the system, never get the ticket. The result? Total double-action chaos. One part makes a plan, another part wakes up with a completely blank slate and no memory of the plan. To the outside world, this missing communication looks exactly like intentional self-sabotage, but it's really just total isolation. Section 2. The dysregulation deception. Diagnostic overshadowing. Let's see what happens when this complex hardware issue runs headfirst into standard therapy. The sources map out this terrifying pipeline of erasure that happens constantly in clinical settings. First, a patient exhibits involuntary switching between alters, but the clinician, who is often driven by a fear of professional liability or just looking foolish for diagnosing a highly stigmatized condition, engages in defensive charting. They relabel this neurological switching as a mere emotional mood swing. Before you know it, the true trauma diagnosis is entirely overwritten by a behavioral personality disorder label. And that mislabeling completely changes the trajectory of a patient's entire life. Because here's the core of the issue. Clinicians are essentially trying to force a simple software patch onto a massive hardware difference. When therapy is designed to fix a behavioral choice or a failure to cope, and you apply it to a brain whose physical structure is fundamentally partitioned for survival, it's going to crash the system every single time. It completely and utterly invalidates the patient's organic reality. Section 3. The impossible catch-22, punishing the symptom. Now we can see the devastating clinical trap created by all this. Take standard treatments like dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT. A core requirement of DBT is filling out daily diary cards to continuously track your emotions. But wait a sec. Remember that amnesic reality we just talked about? The clinician is demanding continuous memory from a system defined by structural amnesia. The alter fronting on Tuesday might literally have zero idea that Monday's diary card even exists. And that creates an Orwellian tragedy. The sources highlight this exact scenario perfectly. They note that therapy is held hostage until the patient completes a task their disorder makes physically impossible. Instead of recognizing a real neurological barrier, clinicians label the patient's amnesia as willful noncompliance. They are effectively kicking patients out of therapy for exhibiting the very symptoms of the illness they're seeking help for. It's absolutely wild. And it gets worse, because this misunderstanding often leads to severe iatrogenic harm. That's a profound, tragic paradox where the psychological damage is caused directly by the healer. Think about it. When a therapist views a genuine trauma symptom as just attention-seeking behavior, they might use a technique called gray rocking. That's where they deliberately withhold all empathy to avoid reinforcing the behavior. But for a trauma survivor, that flawlessly replicates the cold, punishing emotional abandonment of their original abusers. Section 4. What gets left out? The price of normalcy. Let's talk about what vital healing just gets completely abandoned when the medical system rigidly demands that a multi-mind system act perfectly normal to receive care. Look at this translation. It's so revealing. In medical charts, genuine trauma survival mechanisms are systematically rewritten as character flaws. True dissociative amnesia is charted as malingering or inconsistency. Involuntary switching is charted as emotional dysregulation. A desperate cry for help becomes attention-seeking. And when a protector alter steps forward to bravely defend the system from clinical harm, it's charted as being combative or aggressive. Because the therapy is so laser-focused on managing these charted behaviors, the actual realities of DID recovery are completely left out. The severe amnesia walls are ignored. Zero internal communication is fostered between the isolated parts. When you demand a patient stabilize and stop switching before they get help, you are actively isolating the alters and preventing them from ever learning how to collaborate as a team. The root trauma is never addressed. Section 5. The cost of denial. Biological erasure. Having a malingering or dysregulation label permanently attached to a medical chart doesn't just cause psychological pain. We need to look at the life-threatening physical neglect it causes. The sources provide this harrowing, real-world example of just how dangerous this is. The sepsis evidence. A patient reported severe physical symptoms for months, only to have their clinicians continually dismiss them as mere anxiety and somatic fixations. The result? A 104.8-degree fever and emergency hospitalization for sepsis. Their genuine, life-threatening physical agony was viewed strictly through the clinician's false lens of exaggeration. And you know what? It happens repeatedly. A broken toe gets dismissed as dramatic behavior. Crucial sleep medication for real neurological lesions is rejected in favor of impossible-to-keep sleep journals. Even highly elevated psychological test scores are viewed by algorithms as the patient faking bad rather than a literal, accurate description of their daily, fragmented reality. Objective data is entirely ignored just to maintain this subjective, flawed psychiatric narrative. So, how do patients survive this profound lack of support with absolute radical ingenuity? They actually engineer an external brain, building cognitive prosthetics like detailed whiteboards and security cameras to manually track time and pass messages between alters. It's brilliant, but tragically, instead of marveling at and supporting this incredible adaptation, clinicians often mock these vital tools. They dismiss them as writing novels or call them highly atypical, using the patient's coping skills as proof that they are just imitating and disorder. This all builds to one undeniable truth from the sources. This isn't about the patient failing therapy. It's about the therapy fundamentally failing the patient's system. Forcing a fragmented mind to cure its own symptoms before it is allowed to receive trauma care is quite literally like showing up to a house fire and criticizing the homeowner for screaming too loudly. It just makes no sense. So, we have to ask, when a therapeutic model misunderstands a human being this profoundly, when it demands you pretend to be a single, normal mind as the only acceptable ticket to receive care for your trauma, does it stop being a tool for healing and simply become a system of control? Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer. It's a heavy topic, but an absolutely crucial one. See you next time.